Hey everyone, welcome so much. Welcome so much. Welcome to the adult fiction debut panel. I am so excited for this. I've wanted to do an adult fiction debut panel for years now, which isn't like the only fault is mine actually, but I'm really excited that I was able to get this fabulous list of authors to chat about their books, and it's the first of the series. So I did also get many ducks in a row to finally kick this off. Um, I just want to mention as well before we start a rule of housekeeping, basically that this is a safe space for the panels, and so we don't tolerate any harassment of any kind. So I just wanted to put that out into the universe first. I'm going to say a little bit about me, and then all the authors are going to tell us about their books, and then we're going to chat. I have a lot of questions that I'm very excited to discuss. If you have any questions, then definitely drop them in the chat for us, and I will remember to go back to them throughout the discussion. So, my name is Lily, and I'm the book person behind Utopia State of Mind, and I'm very excited to be here. So, Tati, do you want to start off with the introductions?
Sure. Hi, my name is Tati Richardson. I am a podcaster and a romance writer from Atlanta, Georgia. The Build Up is my debut contemporary rom com with Karina Press, and I am super excited to be here. And I'm probably the oldest person here on the panel, I think. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
Should I go ahead or yeah? I'm Natasha Siegel. So my debut, Solomon's Crown, came out on Tuesday, which actually feels really surreal. Thank you. I write historical fiction and historical romance. Solomon's Crown is a queer historical romance about two medieval kings. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you all. This is my first online event, so please go easy on me.
Hey everybody, I'm Kristen May Chase. I may have to gently fight Tati on the oldest person here because there's no way you look like you're I don't know, 20. So you may have really good lighting. I'm not sure, but I'm super excited to be here. I'm totally fangirling, which I imagine a lot of people are doing right now, seeing all of these incredible authors. So my book is 1,000 Miles to Graceland. It came out, oh my gosh, it's already been 2 months. I can't believe it. And it's what I think is, I guess, considered contemporary women's fiction, if we're being official. And it's a fun, epic road trip that a 40-something woman who is mixed race Chinese American takes her 70-year-old Elvis-obsessed mother, and they take a road trip from El Paso, Texas to Memphis, because that's what you want to do when you're trying to heal a relationship. You just want to sit in a car with someone that you kind of don't really get along with for many hours. So anyway, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to chat with everybody.
Hi everyone, I'm Kyla. After graduating from university in 2021, I now work in Silicon Valley, and The Fraud Squad is my debut novel. It's compared to Crazy Rich Asians meets The Devil Wears Prada meets Inventing Anna, and it's about a working class woman who pretends to be a socialite in order to get her dream job at this posh magazine, and it's set in my hometown of Singapore.
Hi, I'm Carlin. I am a romance and thriller writer in YA and adult. And my debut rom-com, queer rom-com out with Vintage Anchor is called Sizzle Reel, and it's about a 24-year-old talent manager's assistant who comes out as bi and tries to sort of make up for lost time by trying to get with an ambiguously gay actress client. And I'm really excited to be here.
Just as a side note, before I start asking the questions, I let my mom a copy of 1,000 Miles to Graceland, and she was like, they have a lot to unpack on this road trip. I was like, yeah, that's the whole point.
That's why they have so much time. driving across Texas. I'm not sure if anyone has driven across Texas, but I did this road trip a few years ago, and I've lived in the South, but I lived in Atlanta. And then I lived in Mississippi, and I drove that trip, and it is like 10 hours to go from like El Paso to the Louisiana, like Texas border. And I was like, oh my gosh, it is so long. So yeah, they have plenty of time to unpack their issues.
The first question that I have for everyone is I want to talk a little bit about your journeys to publication from the inspiration of the book all the way to to the now, because I just love finding out like the differences and the similarities about people's journeys. Tati, do you want to start off?
Sure. So, the inspiration for my book was, if you all are familiar with like the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, and the rom-coms that like Queen Latifah starred in, I wanted a book that like felt like that centered a plus size African American woman, professional woman. And I used to just love, those were kind of the movies that I kind of grew up on and just really enjoyed. And I wanted a book that really, really felt that same way and gave those same vibes, that was like culturally relevant and representative of my particular pocket of generation. And so my journey to publication was very interesting. I started writing before the pandemic. And then after that, I decided to join a romance group called Inclusive Romance Project. And from there, I got like a lot of mentorship and a lot of feedback on this particular work. At the time, it was kind of a work in progress that I was finishing up. And I decided to pitch it for DV Pitt on Twitter. For those not familiar with DV Pitt, it is Diverse Voices Pitch. And so I had to pitch my book as something that would be unique to the landscape of contemporary romance. And so I pitched it as Just Right meets Can You Keep a Secret by Sophie Kinsella. And I got a lot of hits on it. And from there, at the same time, I was in a mentorship program. And I got a lot of hits, got a lot of rejections in between that time. But I also got a couple of what's called revised and resubmits from a couple of agencies, one of which was Carina Press. And I decided to use my mentorship period to take that time to revise it and work on it before I submitted it back. And I submitted it, and probably it was like months and months later, I was getting really nervous. I was like, oh my God, maybe I should just like pull it. My friends were like, no, don't pull it. And so weeks after my birthday at the time, and by the way, I'm 43. I'll be 44 next when my book comes out. It was weeks after my birthday. I got a call or email from Carina saying, we really are interested in the book and we want to publish it. And I was like, what? So that was kind of my journey to publication. So from publication to writing it is probably about a 2.5, 3 year process.
I had a similar, I guess, driving force, like just in terms of representation to Tati. I'm 46, so I am older. Woo! So yay. My character is also in her 40s. So there were very many similarities to that. So, it was really, for me, it was about representation. And it was also like, so the protagonist is Grace and she's in her 40s, but the mom's name is Laura Lynn, and she is a Chinese American woman about to turn 70 and is like super Elvis obsessed. And it was just, I think for me, it was about the character at first. And honestly, I wrote an entire book about Elvis, and I don't even know why I started, because it's been so long. I wrote this book. It's been almost like 12 years since I started writing. So people have asked, which is an obvious question, like why Elvis? And I feel like at this point I should make something up because I just say, I don't remember actually, just that I was so drawn to that character. And it took me a really long time. I have 4 kids. I do all sorts of other things for work. And I got to the point after taking a couple writing classes, and I think maybe the panel can agree that at a certain point, you're just like, I can't look at this anymore. I'm so tired of these words. I need to do something. And so I felt that I had gotten to the point. I actually had worked with a developmental editor kind of 3/4 of the way through in my journey. And I had felt really confident. I knew the book was kind of short. But I was like, you know what? I feel like I can find an agent. I'm, fingers crossed. I had no experience with that process. I'm like, I can find an agent who maybe could help me get it to where it needs to be. Like, I know it's almost there, but I need that person who is invested in my work enough to like want to get it to the next level. And I have to say, I feel like that's rare these days. I don't know about everybody else's experience, but I just feel like in many cases, agents like really want something that's kind of ready to go out. And I was so fortunate after many rejections, many people were like, no one cares about Elvis, which PS, hi, Elvis movies. I don't believe you. But people were like, you hear all the things. No one cares about Elvis. No one cares about 40 somethings and 70 somethings, which of course they say that in a nicer way. But I found an amazing agent who her thing was she was really drawn to my 70-year-old character and all of her quirks and really believed in the book. And we actually edited it, for a year before it went out to submission. And I feel so fortunate that I found someone who was so invested in me as a writer and the project itself to be willing to take that much time, because I know there are a lot of agents that wouldn't be willing to do that. So anyway, that's what happened. I ended up at Grand Central forever, and I couldn't, be more happy with how everything turned out. So anyway, that's my story.
So for me, I started writing in the summer of 2020. It was the summer after my 3rd year of university and before I became a senior. So it was during the pandemic, and it was also the time of rising anti-Asian racism. So I really wanted to write a story that was very joyful and vibrant, but where Asians could be the stars instead of, just like on the sidelines. And my book that is set in high society and in the high fashion world, it was inspired by my own experiences working at magazines like Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Tatler. And those introduced me to high society and allowed me to kind of observe up close socialites. So I kind of put everything that I experienced and observed into my book. Yeah, so my publication journey, I worked on this book for about, I want to say like 9 months before I decided to look for an agent. And then I found an amazing agent. She's with Creative Artists Agency. And then around the time I graduated, so I think it was one day before my 23rd birthday, I went out on submission, which is the process whereby your agent sends your manuscript out to different publishers. And then exactly 1 year after I started writing my book, I got to announce my book deal. So I just love like on the anniversary, I could announce it.
I think in kind of contrast to the 9 months number, I actually wrote this book for 10 years before it came out. So it was kind of a complicated journey in that I started writing it actually when I was in high school. So I was 15 when I wrote the first chapter of this book. I had it all planned out. At the time, I was like this big history nerd. I was going through a big medieval history phase. I was sort of coming to terms with my own queerness, and I found out that there had been this rumor about these 2 medieval kings, that they'd had a romance, and that really sort of captured me. I had this big plan. I was going to like get the whole book done. I was going to be this amazing teenage author, like publishing an adult book. Obviously, it did not happen that way. I wrote, I think, maybe a quarter of it, and then I got hit by chronic illness for a lot of my teenage years. So I basically just ended up not writing anything from the ages of 16 to sort of 19. I was just not really well enough, and actually I suffered some low-grade amnesia and forgot that the book existed, which I know probably sounds completely mad, but is 100% true. I had a whole plan for it and a lot written, and I just completely forgot that I'd done any of this stuff. And then in my first year of university, I was trying to put off studying for my exams because I didn't want to study. And I was looking through my old documents, and I found a document that was just like a keyboard smash was the name of the document. And I opened it up, and it was about 6 or 7 chapters of a book I'd written like 8 years beforehand. And I thought it was like shockingly good. So I thought I would try and write it out. And I spent about 9 months after that drafting it. And I went on querying to agents way too fast. Like, I did not edit it enough. And very understandably, a lot of agents were saying like, there is something good here, but it's a mess. And so I spent a long time querying. I was being very stubborn about it. And I got an amazing agent who could see that there was something there. So she gave me a huge revise and resubmit, where she was like, make all these changes. It really needs a total rework. I spent the summer before the pandemic doing that, and I signed with her just sort of after the pandemic really hit in the UK. We edited it for a bit longer, and it went on submission. A lot of editors passed on it. It had a lot of really near misses. We were on submission for quite a while. There was a lot of discussion about the time period not being particularly marketable, etc., etc. But I found this amazing editor at Ballantine who just completely understood my vision for it. And so he bought it, and then we spent about 16 months before it was published last week. So a long journey. Yeah. The first few chapters are still pretty recognizably the same ones I wrote 10 years ago, which is kind of crazy.
That's amazing. So basically the inspiration for this book, I worked in Hollywood, like in the assistant, like I was even like intern that they made do assistant work unpaid, like the most wild sort of like Hollywood, like being taken advantage of. I wanted to be a screenwriter, and they kind of tell you like after film school you go on this path and like you do X, Y, and Z, and like your boss will recommend you. It's a lot of promises, and I ultimately was finding right out of college that it was just like I had this dream, but it like the path was not for me. So basically I quit that, but before I had quit, I had gotten to go to the Crazy Rich Asians premiere with one of my boss's clients, and watching that movie, I was like, wow, I was like blown away creatively by sort of the rom-com renaissance when that had happened. And I was like, okay, like I want to write a rom-com, and I actually want to base it off of this experience that I had. And then also like concurrently issues with my identity and queerness and stuff like that. So I wanted to combine it all and sort of take that very messy situation and make it more escapist and have it have a happy ending. So I actually wrote it as a script, because at the time I thought I was a screenwriter. And then my author friend was like, hey, this should be a book, like write it as a book. And I'd only written thrillers up until then as books. And I was like, okay, like I'll try it out. And I ended up drafting the book, and I think it was 10 days. And so I was like, okay, like I have this book now. And so I was agented, and a previous book had died on submission. And then right when I finished it, my agent left agenting, but she was like, hey, I'm going to give you off to someone else in the agency. So I started with her. I think it was around August 2019. I like started grad school for an MFA because I thought that was going to be my new path in life. And my new agent, we were working on 2 projects. Again, I was doing a thriller, and then I had this project. She gave me notes for both. And I was like, I don't want to do the rom-com anymore. Like your notes, like, you know, there's just too much. So I put it aside for like, I want to say a year to work on this other book. And one of my grad school friends' husbands dropped into my DMs and was like, I heard you have this book. Like, can I read it? And I was like, sure. Like, I'm not going to do anything with it, but go ahead. And he read it and gave me these extensive notes and was so passionate about it that I'm like, okay, wait, maybe I do need to have to go back to this project. So I did all his notes and finally went back to my agent after the other book had again died on submission. I think it was like, let's say like May 2021, I think. We did one exclusive submission with an editor, didn't work out. We went wider in June, and I had an offer by July. So it was like, thank you to my 2 friends who are basically pushing me to do this book. And now it's going to be out next month.
Okay, we're already getting questions, but I have a few more questions that I want to ask first. But I want to first pair some books together. And so I want to first start off with the Fraud Squad and Sizzle Reel. One thing I really loved in both of your books is how your novels both examines what happens when we are so convinced we want something, or like we're so convinced we know what our dream is, like what our thing is going to be. Um, and then what happens instead, right? And so I would love to know for both of you if you could talk about what drew you to this theme, which I felt like kind of was like a gut punch, honestly, in both of the books. Um, and so, what about this? Like, any comments from both of you about this intersection between ambition and expectations? Kyla, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So my book is called The Fraud Squad, and I think in hindsight, even though I didn't realize it at the time, I was trying to kind of unpack and explore my own sense of imposter syndrome by writing about an actual imposter. So, for context, I'm from Singapore, which is a predominantly Chinese country. And then when I was 18, I moved to California to attend Stanford University, which is a predominantly white elite institution. And a lot of my classmates were from some of the wealthiest families. Their last names were on the sides of buildings on campus, and everyone just seemed so sophisticated and mature. And I just always felt this like acute sense of not knowing where I belong and not knowing if I deserve to be there. And it's a feeling that kind of just like comes up time and time again. And I do think it's a very universal experience to feel imposter syndrome at any stage in your life. So in my main character, I wrote, she pretends to be a socialite. She wears designer brands. She knows how to say the right things and do the right things. But deep down, she knows that this isn't a world that she truly belongs in. And all the whole time, she's just constantly fearing that she's going to get exposed as a fraud. And like you said, Lily, like it's just this constant tension between what she wants to achieve, but also like, can she do it? Like, does she deserve to be there?
I think for me, partially came from like my own experience, and it's something it kind of taught. It's sort of a universal creative thing, but it was especially prominent in aspiring filmmakers. Was this idea of like you have this passion, you can like full force know what you're going to do, but because there's so little guarantee and so much that progression, it hinges on other people. It's like I feel like so many people I knew, like you would have these crises, and a lot of people would end up leaving the industry like very early because it was so hard, and there was just no clear path in sight to get what you want. So I wanted to explore like this idea of someone going through that and like what that actually looks like and what it looks like for someone who like is so passionate and sort of knows what they want to do in life but doesn't know how they're going to get it, and like how hard can you hold on to a dream before like you have like what does it take to let it go, and can you still find happiness in other ways? Like where do you find that amid the sort of in between of like having traditional success and straight up quitting, like what is it like to still exist there? And I just wanted to explore that, and like hopefully someone who's going through that will now be able to sort of see an example of like someone who does end up happy in the end, even though it's not exactly how they planned to do in the beginning.
Yeah, and I think that what I also loved about pairing these, like both of your books as well, I think is that in both of those industries, you have a lot of this idea that like you kind of suffer at the very beginning for like nothing, but then eventually it's worth it. But then like you get so focused on what will happen when it finally becomes worth it. And then like sometimes it's just not worth it. It was a lot. It was a lot to like of therapy, basically. um I now want to talk about the build up and 1,000 miles to Graceland because I think in both of these, your main characters have to confront difficult conversations about what scares them. Um, and not only like about what happens in our past and sort of how that impacts our, our who we are today, but also kind of like fears as defense mechanisms as well. So I wanted to know if both of you could talk about how your characters' backstories came to you, like when you thought of this book. Um, when you first thought of these characters, including side characters, did you always know the intricacies of all of their past? Kristen, do you want to start?
This is a great question. And actually, gosh, Story Genius talks a lot about this. I don't know if anyone has read the book Story Genius, but it's such a big part of her approach, right? Is like no matter where you start your novel or your book, you need to know how they got to that point. So backstory is so important. And I actually, like Carlin in some ways, like kind of the opposite. Like I was writing fiction, and then while I was waiting for other projects that were on submission, I was like, oh, it was actually one project. It was my next novel, was with my editor. And while I was waiting, I was like, it would be kind of cool to write this as a screenplay. So I went the other way, which is kind of interesting. And when you write a screenplay in particular, you really need to know the backstory so, so, so much. So I guess a lot of Grace is my character. A lot of her backstory was similar to mine. And I'm sort of heartened by hearing from everyone how much their own life in some ways contributed, because, a lot of people ask me, I have written nonfiction. This is my debut fiction. And, I do a lot of parenting essays and personal essays. And, the question is like, how do you do that? Because when you write nonfiction, it's very much like fact-based. Like you want to get it right and be accurate. And so it can be hard, like, especially since I did this road trip. I was like, oh, wait, there was a girl and she was 17 and she worked at Johnny's Barbecue. So like, I have to make her that character. And then I'm like, wait, but do I? Because it's fiction. Like it's just a weird place to be. But with Grace in particular, it was drawn from, my personal life and in some ways. And it wasn't actually intended to be that way. A lot of the stuff that I started with was all about Laura Lynn, her mom. And I wrote a ton about Laura Lynn. And that was one of the edits that I heard from a bunch of different people in my class. And my developmental editor was like, your protagonist is Grace. And like, she's kind of like, no one's connecting with, like, I can't really connect with her. She's sarcastic, which is kind of how I am. But like, you really need to develop her more. Like, what's going on there? Like, why does she feel disenchanted in her life? Why does she decide to do this road trip with her mom, who she is estranged from? Like, it needs to all make sense more. So I drew from my own experience, but really took the advice of other people who were like, you need to make this character come to life. I don't know if anyone else feels this way on the panel, but like, I kind of have best friend syndrome, or like my best friends or my other characters are like super fun and awesome. But sometimes my protagonist is a little, I don't want to say bland, but like it takes me a little more effort for whatever reason to make my main character. I'm good with all the surrounding characters. So that's been a struggle for me as a writer. But certainly that backstory, I don't want to give too much away, of course, because it's part of the important part of the novel, came from my own experience and from advice from other people, because that why question, as we all know, is so important in stories. So that's me.
I know for the build-up and in crafting Ari, particularly, there are times, particularly as a Black woman, that you're the only whatever in the room, the only Black person, the only woman. You're crossing so many identities off. And for Ari, she's sometimes the only Black woman, the only professional, the only person in the room in her profession as an architect. And I drew some of the inspiration from Ari. Very, very small, quirky things about Ari are a lot like me. Her obsession with, Wonder Woman and, all that good stuff. That's a lot like me. But also the part where Ari feels frustrated as a professional sometimes, in the fact that she's, has to work twice as hard to be shown the respect that she's, owed, because she's brilliant as an architect. But because of either her being a woman or her size or her being Black, all those things compounded, people don't really recognize that in her. So I think I definitely have felt that way in a lot of professional settings. But specifically her job as an architect, I definitely drew inspiration from friends of mine who were architects. One friend in particular who is an architect, who kind of, when I had the idea for the book at first, Ari and Porter were going to work in like construction. And I was like, I don't know anything about construction. I wanted something a little more glamorous. So I said, oh, let me think about architects. And so the person that I knew was an architect. I actually talked to her for like 2 hours, and it was so enlightening. Her telling me about how, architecture is a very male dominated space. Architecture also has a very small percentage of Black folks, and within that percentage of Black folks is an even smaller percentage of Black women who are doing architecture, and all the things that she had to go through, being mistaken for a secretary or thinking that she's not the person coming to present. Those are some things I definitely wanted to reflect in Ari's struggles. And not only that, as someone who's also plus size, Ari is a very confident person about her size. It's everybody else who has a problem with her size, not her. So for me, that's also, I wanted to craft an individual, particularly a character like that, who is confident and self-assured about themselves in all other arenas except love. Because love is the one challenge that she has. And as you were talking earlier about like the struggles and things, I just talked about this last night on Instagram, where people's frustration with Ari as a character was, oh my gosh, she's so indecisive. For her to be in her 40s, why is she so indecisive? And I thought to myself, she's a human having a human experience. I think she's owed that grace to be indecisive about who she is as a character. And she was the one character that I truly had completely fleshed out when I was creating that. I knew her part of her character was going to be that indecisiveness. As for Porter, there were small things about him that I wanted to pick up on, that he was, from a privileged background, and he had, he was, very, very unsure of himself, whereas Ari's a super confident person, what people on the outside wouldn't think she is. Porter on the outside appears to be super confident, but he's really not. He's very insecure about things. He's a people pleaser. He's not sure why he even became an architect in the first place, which is some of the things that he's toying with in the book. So those are some things that I really wanted to explore with those characters, and fleshing those out and having like these fully rounded, capable characters in this setting, in this world that I knew nothing about until I was doing like, severe research about it, was really, really challenging. As for side characters, I knew I wanted most of them to be supportive and funny and lighthearted, but the challenge for me was crafting someone who was villainous, and crafting someone who was so dubious and villainous was so hard for me, because for me, I knew that I wanted Ari and Porter to work in an all Black architecture firm. So for another Black character to come at another Black character in a negative way, I didn't want it to be seen as, super stereotypical or negative, which is, a lot of the burden that you have as a Black writer often sometimes. So hopefully I answered that question about, carving characters and what about them is a lot like me. So, and a lot of Porter and the people pleasing and stuff like that was me a time ago. So yeah, I definitely can relate to the crafting of the characters.
Yeah, I think that I knew pretty quickly I was gonna really, really love Ari, but I think the depth of my feeling for Porter, I think, kind of took me off guard. I think because of exactly what you're saying, right? This like outward facade of looking like super like you have it all together, but then secretly having these kinds of deep insecurities which you don't know how to vocalize. I felt like that was super like resonating to at least me, and I'm sure to other people as well.
Yes, I definitely, particularly for, we have a small pocket of men who read romance, right? So when men read romance and are able to sympathize with male characters who are not, that they can kind of see themselves in, that's what was my highest compliment, to hear men saying, wow, I feel a lot like Porter sometimes.
And then for In Solomon's Crown, what I loved how you like explored this in so many different ways, but I loved how you really explore the very heavy mantle of responsibility. I felt like that was going to be like a sure thing from the beginning, because these people have such large responsibilities and duties, and like in a lot of ways their lives are not in their control. But also what I loved is that you balance them with these really intimate, like joyful moments. as well in Solomon's Crown. And so I wanted to know how you balance that, right? You have these historical events and like this historical inspiration, right? While also bringing these like also really cherished everyday moments into like the fabric of your characters' lives.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think the sort of relationship between the history and the fiction is definitely relevant there. And I think it's a lot reflecting my sort of psychological landscape and that arduous 10-year process of writing, to be honest, because I think a lot of people who've read Solomon's Crown have possibly assumed that one of the reasons it's very inaccurate is because I didn't really want to do the research. And I actually had, like at the beginning when I wrote it, I had a plan for a very accurate sort of historical epic. It was going to be like 200,000 words long, and it was going to be really grim and dark and awful, to be honest with you. And very tragic, because when I started writing it and I was still a teenager, to me, that was largely what history was. Like, as a queer woman, as a Jewish woman as well, a lot of my experiences with history were so centered around tragedy to some extent. And a lot of the queer books that I read that I loved and I still loved had very tragic endings when they had historical settings. I think when I returned to the book later, I had myself gone through a journey where I sort of managed to accept some elements of my illness and also just in general become a much more happy and realized person, and sort of starting to learn to celebrate those elements of responsibility, I guess, that I felt to like history as well and to my own identity. So when I returned to the book, I realized that I just didn't want it to be a tragedy anymore. I wanted it to reflect those joyful moments in my life and in my recovery as much as I wanted it to reflect those stresses that had defined a lot of sort of my process of growing up. And I mean, the Kings in the book are also growing up. It sort of begins with them being a teenager and it ends with them as adults. So I really thought what I wanted to do was use that historical framing to sort of explore some of the universality of those elements of life, like the fact that we love people, whether it's platonic or romantic. And I felt like that dramatic element of responsibility you were mentioning with them being kings, it sort of accentuates how those elements of life can still be present and in the most desperate of situations, right? In the most exceptional of situations. And then we're all deserving in some way of pursuing the joyous moments. And so that became the priority for me over accuracy. And so the history very much was that foundation, a sort of a framework, but what's really important to me is that emotional journey. And I changed what I felt I needed to get that emotional journey across. So that was where the historical elements sort of fell by the wayside when I felt like I wanted to more communicate that idea of finding joy even when things are sort of dark around you.
I love that you changed it. I feel like I obviously didn't know until this panel, right? Like the differences between the first drafts and like the what you have now. But I feel like that idea of accuracy also tied, especially in history, to suffering, I think is so important to like honor, but also recognize that so many other facets of emotions are tied up with those things, you know, like their everyday and the pockets of hope and sort of love that they find within every moment. We have a lot of questions, so I'll like change over to the questions from the audience. And I think one of the first ones I saw was, what challenges did you all face trying to work and feel creative during the pandemic? It's like a big question. I don't know who wants to start like to bite that one off.
Well, I had it kind of easy, I think, because I was I had finished. So in some ways, if I let me just remember correctly. So yeah, so I was agented in 2020, in May of 2020, and then I actually did the road trip that's in my book, which is drivable. It is actually almost 1,000 miles. I joke and say like 1,627 miles to Graceland just doesn't have like a good ring. So it was like 981. But I did the road trip. And interestingly, Elvis's birthplace, which is in Tupelo, had just opened up because it had been closed due to the pandemic. So for me, I was actually really inspired for several reasons. One, because I did the road trip. So for me, editing was just it came to life because I had written about all those stops. And actually, I can see, I don't know, I'm peeking at the comments. And one of the questions for me, I can just answer it, was that, is there a Buc-ee's pit stop on the road trip? There's not. There's an Allsups. So Allsups is a Texas like convenience store chain. So that's what's in the book, not a Buc-ee's. I think I'm saying that right. So that was also one thing. I think for me, because I had kids at home, they weren't at school, I kept everybody online. I needed an escape, right? Like writing for me is an escape anyway, but it was like, I was so motivated to get the edits done at that point in time because I was just agented. And to me, like getting the edits done meant I was going to be on submission. So I was super motivated. And I also was motivated because I knew that I needed the escape, right? My kids are home 24/7. I'm not leaving the house for my job. And so to be able to like step into my office, or what I would do is sit in my bed at like 5 a.m. with my computer, was a treat for me. So, that's how and I think it will all depend. I'll be curious to hear where everybody was in their writing process, but that's how it was for me.
Yeah, I think similarly, writing was an escape for me during the pandemic. So back when I was still a college student living on campus, I always felt kind of self-conscious about my love for reading and writing because my university was in Silicon Valley, and most of my classmates studied computer science or history. So yeah, I just always felt like a little bit inferior because of my creative interest. And so the pandemic was hard for many people in a lot of ways. But I guess one silver lining for me was that because I was living alone during the pandemic, so it felt like for the first time, I didn't have to care about what other people were thinking or saying about my interest. I wasn't aware of their expectations, and I wasn't obliged to do this for anyone else. Like writing was an activity I did only for myself. When I first started writing the book, I never thought of getting it published. So I was really writing the story that I wanted to read. And I think that really kept me going because I love my story a lot. And writing it, like what Kristen said, felt like a treat. It felt like an escape.
Like everyone else, yeah, I mean, writing was an escape, but it was almost to the extent where like I wrote more during the pandemic than I did any other time. Just I think because I didn't want to stop and like have to think about anything. And so for me, drafting is like the easier one. And I think that contributed to the fact that like I did not revise anything for so long, including sizzle reel, just because like I didn't want to process it. Although I guess the pandemic was also when like I did start revising it. And the other thing was I was in grad school at the time, and it was my grad school friends who were sort of pushing me. And so we all had like a group chat. And I feel like there was an interesting emotional intimacy we had during that time because there was no distractions to not be constantly talking to each other. So there was the constant like stream of being like, are you working on the book or like helping troubleshoot and that sort of thing. So it's actually ideal for me at that time to be doing it then.
The pandemic was like a perfect time for me because it was actually the first time I was able to like slow down in my life. And I was working from home exclusively, even though my daughter was I think she was doing like pre-K Zoom or something, which is a whole other interesting thing. But yeah, it was the first time I was able to slow down and actually focus on the writing. And for a lot of people, the pandemic was a good time for them. I know it was for me. It made me realize what I was, what made me happiest and, what I wanted to prioritize, which was my writing career. And so during that time, I was pretty much in the midst of finishing up revisions and getting it together during my mentorship program. So that's what I kind of took that time to do, plus kind of map out what I wanted to do, like write next. So, I have a bunch of unfinished projects going on now, but a lot of outlines for things that I want to come next. So it was really the time for me to really, really like It was the height of my creativity, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have a slightly opposite experience in that the pandemic was actually, I think, the time in my life when I've been the least productive since I've written. I find that writing for me really requires sort of engagement with, like, I need to go out and walk and see things and like get inspired. And I found it really difficult during the pandemic because I felt this obligation to be using this sudden surfeit of free time to be productive, but everything about my headspace was sort of preventing me from doing that. So in many ways, the pandemic was a real low point for me in terms of my productivity, to be honest. And I think that ties into, I've gotten a couple of comments and questions about how to sort of deal with issues around responsibilities and focus during flare-ups of chronic illness. I obviously have to start with the caveat that like everyone experiences these things very differently. So please take my advice with a grain of salt. For me, when I had my worst flare-ups when I was a teenager, I couldn't write. It just wasn't possible to write at the periods when those were affecting me. And it was a similar issue as I actually kind of had during the pandemic, where I was really stuck sort of in my bed or at home at my desk. And part of me often felt like because I was like not able to go out to work, I wasn't able to go out to school, I need to be productive. I think especially one of the things that anyone who's dealt with chronic illness will know is it's really difficult psychologically to deal with a sense of guilt that you should be doing more, that you might be faking it, that you might be blowing it out of proportion. And I think in the same way, the pandemic sort of did that to a lot of people in the psychological sense of like, I feel so bad and I should be working, I should be making the most of all this free time I've got. So I at least, like for me personally, went a similar actual headspace mentally in those two periods of my life. I think one of the important things to keep in mind is a lot of the advice that you'll see as an aspiring author online is very much geared towards people who live certain lifestyles. Something that I read all the time was write every day. That is terrible advice for someone who is dealing with chronic illness flare-ups, because there were many weeks where I could not write every day. I would go months without writing. So I think one of the important things to keep in mind is that you aren't failing by not being able to sort of check that box every time you write. It is okay to write if it's in spurts. And even now, when I'm not dealing with as many flare-ups, I don't write every day, which I think a lot of authors get really shocked by when I say, like, I don't write every day. And yeah, 100% Kate, like it's very good towards neurotypical people, definitely. So letting yourself go of that responsibility is really important, because when you do write, it needs to feel not like something you're forcing yourself to do. It needs to feel like something that is helping you not necessarily escape, but sort of interacting and engage with the world around you. Thank you, Lisa. I'm glad it's helpful. So that's one thing, definitely. And then also maybe allowing yourself to write in strange other ways. Like, for example, if I had a manuscript and I was having sort of the start of a flare up and I couldn't focus, I would actually maybe write a bit of fan fiction, or I'd even sometimes like take characters from something I was writing and write some silly alternate universe thing with them, just as a way to like continue interacting with them, but without the pressure of thinking, I'm not working at 100%. What I write with these people will not be good. It will ruin my manuscript because I'm not in a place to be writing something of quality. So those were things that helped me, definitely. But yeah, just especially taking advice with a grain of salt is really important, because advice often is really expecting you to have 3 free hours a day, no children, no full-time job. You know, the expectations can sometimes be a little ridiculous.
Okay. We have we have a lot of questions, but the next question is from the audience is, what changes will you make in your writing process going into your next project?
With this project, I was much more, I did not plot as much. I definitely pants this a lot more. And for those who don't know what pantsing is, I mean, it's just basically flying by the seat of your pants and just writing whatever you thought, stream of consciousness sometimes. And it's kind of a jigsaw puzzle in the end to try to make it fit. But now I'm much more of a plotter, even if I have a skeletal plot of some sort. Um, it's been extremely helpful for me to go into the next project with a plot or some kind of strategy in which I'm going to write. So I don't like waste my time just sitting here at the computer, just staring at keyboards and not realizing, I need to be typing. But that's the main thing for me. And definitely something I'm going to carry into my next project.
I think is it for everybody? Because I can weigh in that too. As someone who took a really long time to write something, I just don't want to take that long next time if I can avoid it, because I could potentially have grandchildren. I don't know how that plays out if it's another 10 years for me. So, and to Tati's point, as someone who also pantsed it like completely, and also spent a lot of time in my process trying to figure out how to do it. Like I would ask all my friends, I have a lot of lovely author friends, and I'm like, what do I need to do? Should I be outlining? Should I be plotting? Like, can you just tell me how to do this? And they were just like, you have to do what feels right. I'm like, no, that's not the answer I want. I want you to tell me what to do. And so I spent a lot of time doing that. And I spent a lot of time just pantsing it. It all worked out in the end, but a lot like, and in some ways, like Natasha too, like I stepped away for different reasons. And so that for me in some ways can be really cool because it's great to get distance and then come back. You get a different view of your characters. But and I don't have a good reason for forgetting. You have a legitimate reason. Mine is just like, I don't know, I'm getting old. I like forgot. I'm like, what is this character? Why is this happening? And again, in some ways that could be cool, because I think sometimes we're our most creative when we kind of have to solve a problem. We have to get really creative when there's a no, right? When there's a yes, I mean, you don't have to do anything, but when there's a no, like you have to be creative. So I would like to not take as long. And I would also like to do some sort of outlining, which I have done with other things. And yeah, I think also just kind of trusting myself. I spent a lot of time with this one because it's my debut being like, and we've talked about imposter syndrome. So I think it's very apropos. Like, I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't do this. I don't write fiction. Right. But like, you're writing fiction. So you kind of do. And so I don't know. It shouldn't necessarily have to be that like, oh, you published a book, so now you're a fiction writer. I think for me, I just want to be like, you know what you're doing. You're good. Just do it. Because I also spent a lot of time kind of pushing up against my own belief about whether I could do this or not. And that is just time consuming and it takes away from creative energy, really.
I think for me, the biggest change has been so in between writing Sizzle Reel and now I have a full-time job. And it started to be like, oh, you kind of like know that you're capable of writing in like a couple hours in the evening and stuff like that. And so I used to go into the mindset of like, oh, I have to use every free hour that I have to the writing in order to get it done as quickly as possible and to like have lead time for like anxiety reasons. And I'm just like, you know what? I'm gonna actually just start writing when like I have the creative inspiration to do it. Obviously, like bar deadlines that require you to get something done. Like if that's not a problem, to just not actually try to write less and be more purposeful about when I'm writing and really like being in the moment and trying to find the joy in it as opposed to having it become like a chore.
One change that I made was that I stopped reading books outside my genre. So when I was working on the Fraud Squad, I think in my very first round of revisions, I was also reading this dark, very dark fantasy. And as a result, my book became pretty dark itself. And then my characters became like quite hateful. And I remember my beta reader was reading it and she was like, wait, what happened to your characters? The entire tone and vibe of the story changed. And I basically had to scrape the entire draft and start rewriting from scratch. So I have 2 more books coming out next year. And for those 2 books, when I was working on them, and even when I'm revising them now, I don't read anything outside of that genre. And one of the books is a middle grade book. And So when I'm working on that book, I only read middle grade books so that I could really capture the voice of like a young person. I'm not going to be reading any adult historical fiction when I'm working on that.
I think probably to echo what some other people have said, like I completely pantsed my first book. Like I didn't really plot it at all before I wrote, and now I've sort of learnt I need to do a little bit of that, or I end up with something that's got no pacing whatsoever. So I have been trying with my second book, which is coming out next year, to be more mindful of pacing in particular, because I think that's my weak point, and trying to plot it properly. But I found really actually reverse outlining as a concrete thing is something I found super helpful. As someone who like struggles to draft with a plan because I get sort of angry about having to stick to it, instead finishing the first draft and looking back on it and trying to figure out where the problems are, that's been really, really helpful. I think similar to Kyler, I have also tried to read more in my genre. I haven't gone cold turkey on other genres because I just like can't give up my fantasy novels. I can't, but trying to read more directly and purposefully in my genre and try and understand what authors are doing that's successful and what I like has been really, really helpful. Yeah.
Okay, the last question that we'll have, because I will always try to pick like a really happy question to end on. And I really loved this question when I saw it. And it says, the publishing world can have a lot of lows and struggles, but what moments made this feel worth it or help keep the spark alive? I just thought this was such a nice question.
I'm happy to start. I think for me, honestly, interacting with other authors has been something unexpected. Like I wasn't part of any writing groups or anything like that before I got my agent. I was pretty much flying completely solo, meeting new authors, and also like having some authors that I've always really admired like interact with me has been a really unexpected joy that's been really, really wonderful. It's like you sort of discover a new community, and that's been amazing, like as well as readers obviously, but yeah, meeting other authors and getting to chat with them like this is a huge privilege. It's really, really cool.
I want to echo some of that as well. Meeting authors who I like have admired since reading them for like decades, and like going on Instagram and seeing them with my book in their hand at the beach saying, "Hey, I'm reading this. I got an arc. I'm reading this." I'm like, my mind is blown away by that. So those are some really, really joyful experiences that I've had. And they really kind of keep me going. I think one of the most joyful things I experienced was an author that I admire, romance author that I admired, like inboxed me on Instagram. Was like, "I need to call you right now." And I thought, like, oh my God, like, what did I do? I was like, what happened? And so I said, sure, give me a call. And then she called me and said, look, we have to talk about this book. And so she wanted to talk about the book, and, you know, she really enjoyed it and everything. And I was just like, gosh, that like meant the world to me. I was like about to cry. So, I mean, those are some of the super joyful moments for me, just seeing my colleagues that I respect in my industry, in my genre, enjoy the book.
I too have found the community to be so supportive, and I think that's lovely. And I mean, I've just learned so much, honestly, in this last hour. Than like it's this is the kind of stuff that you don't necessarily get in a class per se, and you don't necessarily get in I don't know, in a book, right? Like these interactions with other people and just hearing their stories and experiences. It's been wonderful. I guess for me, you know, so my book was sold in 2021 and it came out in 2023. So that's 2 years. And over the course of those 2 years, and I don't know what everyone else's experience is like because we all have different publishers, but there were just so many happy, like little moments. They're like, hey, we have your cover art. And you're like, ah, and like, hey, we have this review came out, or, you know, this person requested your arc, or now you're on Goodreads. Like there were just so many moments. Like we have your proofreader, you know, I get excited about proofreading. Like I nerd out about like, especially when my timeline is messed up, like my person was too old for the time that I had her graduate from college. And I just love that kind of person. Like that's a special kind of person who can take a 70,000 word book and be like, you stopped here, but then you went here. You need to come back here. I'm like, thank you so much for everything you do. But over the course of those 2 years, it's just, there's all these like little exciting moments that happen that I didn't really know about. I've written nonfiction and did not have that experience that I had with a novel. And that's a credit, I think, to my publisher and to the publicist. And it's just thrilling. Like even just like getting your author photos done. It's like, it's coming out. Like you rarely have something in life, particularly in adulthood, I think, that like you have to look forward to in like 18 months or 2 years time. It's so exciting. And so that's been the best part for me, is just all those little like, every time I would get an email from my editor or from, my publisher or anything, I knew it was going to be, probably good. Right. And like, how cool is that? Because most of the time it's like emails, you're like, oh, here we go. But I always knew it was going to be something to look forward to.
I think interacting with readers makes me really happy. I think the idea that something I created could make someone else, could bring like some joy or excitement to someone else's life, like that is such an awesome feeling. And like you all said, interacting with other authors as well, finding this community where now people have become friends, like genuine friends and not just writing friends. That is also so amazing. And like what Kristen said, 2 years is a very long time. So I think the one thing that kept me going was that I genuinely loved my story and that I was happy to work on it and reread it over and over again to try to make it better. I do know that, it is tempting to sometimes feel like you have to write for the market, to write what you think readers would love. But 2.5 years is a very long time to be working on something that you're not genuinely passionate about. So every time someone asks me for writing advice, I always say that the biggest thing is to just like write a story that you want to read, that you want to tell, and that's going to be the one thing keeping you going when you feel like your story is terrible.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of echoing what everyone said, like the writing community, both in terms of authors and readers, has just been incredible. I mean, like my main character, I was very specific about like wanting a character who made a lot of mistakes, like was very like traditionally unlikable, because I wanted to have readers be able to look at that and go, oh, I'm this flawed too, and I can see this character got a happy ending. And like I have had readers DM me about that, and it's like, wow, to think something you had set out to do is like actually happening. I think that's it was such an incredible feeling.
I have loved this panel so much. Oh, and to answer the question as well, these panels have have brought such a spark. They've been like refilling my creative well, which was like totally beyond empty before this. But yeah, thank you all so much for chatting. I've left all the bookshop.org links for everyone's book down below, so definitely make sure to add them to your TBR, order them, pre-order them, do everything. And thank you to our chat as well and all the questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. There are a lot and some like very, very good ones, but you all had just so many good questions that we couldn't get to them. So thank you all. I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day and to like enjoy your future books, whatever they are.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.